Half of Shogun's episodes are done. 5 episodes have passed and 5 are left. The 5th episode of Shogun has been released. And in this episode, Toranaga, Lady Mariko, and John are faced with a disaster. So let's start episode 5. Captain John Blackthorne promised to lend his ship's cannons to Lord Yoshi Toranaga in support of his fledgling war endeavors. He undoubtedly only did so knowing that they would be utilized in combat and not as a thoughtless act of violence carried out by Toranaga's son, Nagakado. Now the gauntlet has all but been thrown down, and it becomes increasingly apparent that Toranaga simply has to commit himself to the path that his son forced them all into, even if it means war looms on the horizon a bit more closely than everyone would like. Before all that happens, however, there's still the complex interpersonal tangling that needs to be addressed between Black Thor and Lady Mariko, especially in the wake of last week's pillowing. It seems more and more apparent that it was Mariko herself who snuck into Blackthorne's room that night, despite her efforts to convince him otherwise the next morning. Her reasons for secrecy are myriad, and definitely play into the eightfold fence we keep hearing about. And, as we learn this week in Chapter 5, in more ways than one on Shogun. Now, I doubt that anyone can claim to have been successfully taken aback when Buntaro, Mariko's husband, a guy that earlier episodes made a concerted effort to convince us, was dead road out of the mist and into Ajiro. But for me, this revealed that wasn't totally exhilarating, and not just because this time around my TV viewing goggles were tuned to the correct theory frequency. The fact that Buntaro was thought to be dead and missing for the previous 20 days was more shocking than the fact that he managed to get to Edo and meet up with Toranaga. Why did it feel like much more time had passed before Mariko and Blackthorne actually gave in to the tension behind all those glances of longing? On the heels of these two knocking boots, the return of her husband is an opportunity riff with delicious drama. And while this week's episode didn't try to rival the previous installment in terms of visceral gore, it did advance things forward by way of revealing at least one very important backstory. Since Mariko has already been tasked to live with Blackthorne in the house Toranaga gifted him in Ajiro, that means Buntaro, looking a little more cut up and bruised in spite of having survived death, is also begrudgingly forced to shack up under the same roof. Considering that Blackthorne's idea of hospitality involves letting a dead pheasant stink up the house while serving the most unappetizing rabbit for dinner, there's no faulting any of the Japanese for turning up their noses in favor of their preferred dishes. Blackthorne and Buntaro's weird defensive energy only starts to get weirder and full of barely tempered machismo when a little more sake gets introduced into the meal, while Mariko attempts to act as a goet in translating their words. Soon, the two men are downing bowlfuls of the fermented beverage, both visibly intoxicated and seemingly on a crash course for something disastrous. But the only person who ends up bearing more than even she likely expected to is Mariko herself, as the dinner reaches a fever pitch of tension. Once Blackthorne continually asks Buntaro to regale them with a story of how he survived. Mariko, having already endured years of being married to this man, warned him against inciting Buntaro's temper further, but it's too late. Buntaro orders a servant to bring his bow to him and requests that Blackthorne choose which post in the entryway he should aim his arrows at. Unthinkingly, Blackthorne chooses the right one, which also happens to be the post Mariko is sitting directly in front of. Buntaro has been progressively getting drunker and drunker all night, barely capable of seeing straight, but Mariko ignores Blackthorne's pleas to move out of the way. Her husband fires 2 arrows, one after the other, so close to her face that the fletching practically skims her nose to hit the post before he collapses in the tipsy heap on the floor. Blackthorne asks Mariko to inform her husband that his wife deserves better treatment than what just transpired, while everyone remains dumbfounded in the aftermath of that display. And Buntaro coolly pours himself another bowl of sake. Blackthorne is confused by Buntaro's mockery of Mariko's notion of showing her any genuine decency until Mariko tells him the truth about her family history on her husband's orders. Mariko's father, who had served a harsh and oppressive take, killed his master in the name of justice. But as a result of his actions, Mariko's family was tracked down and killed. All of her brother's sisters, and even her own mother, were forced to kneel before her father as he carried out their swift execution before committing Zuko himself. Mariko, by contrast, as a newly married woman, was not permitted to take part in the ritual, but every year on the anniversary of her family's murders, she begs her husband to let her take action against this injustice. Unfortunately, Buntaro forbids her from joining her family in death, as Mariko tearfully explains, "My husband orders me to live." Yet she brings up the eightfold fence when it comes time for Blackthorn to process all he's heard, asking him to bury his own feelings about it for both their sakes. Later that night, when Blackthorn hears Buntaro physically beating Mariko in their room and attempts to intervene, even going as far as to chase Buntaro out into the streets of the village in a misguided effort to challenge him, Buntaro refuses to fight, claiming the sake they drank that night was to blame. As Blackthorn realizes that he can in good conscience strike an unarmed man and proceeds to walk away, it's clear that this isn't the last clash between these two that'll play out over the course of the show. While all of this is going on, there's also the matter of that dead bird to address. After Toranaga gifts Blackthorn a pheasant, as a token of his gratitude, the pilot declares he wants the house to prepare the bird properly to be eaten later on, as far as English customs are concerned. However, that means hanging the pheasant up outside, where it's meant to mature for up to a week before presumably dressing it and enjoying it as part of a meal. The only problem is, as Fujitole points out at the beginning of the episode, the pheasant will start to rot, and once that happens, it's going to give off a horrendous stench. But Blackthorn is insistent that things are done his way for once, and in his broken Japanese, he tells all the servants of the house, including the eavesdropping gardener, that it is forbidden to touch the pheasant before then. If touch, die. Since its very first episode, Shogun has been skillfully utilizing the use of language, and by extension the cultural divide that exists between Blackthorn and the Japanese, as a way to heighten drama, offer moments of levity, and provide a more in-depth understanding of this new realm. In many ways, someone like Mariko has leverage in more than one sphere thanks to her knowledge of both Japanese and Portuguese, which is illustrated, as English for audiences is among one of the most powerful characters in the series, solely because of her ability to comprehend what everyone is saying in the given scene. We've witnessed moments where everything being spoken is accurately translated to the letter, as well as instances where someone has blatantly chosen to misconstrue another's words to make them look worse by perception. Slowly, we also see Blackthorn begin to develop a familiarity with the Japanese language. At least he's communicating enough in order to get by. But Broken to the Fist is the first real instance in which he discovers he can't simply utter the first that pops into his head. When combined with Buntaro's homecoming, the dead pheasant could run the risk of being overly symbolic. But it's also kind of interesting, especially as he appears to be the only person the black flies are genuinely circling aside from the decaying bird itself, even though he has already narrowly avoided death on a few occasions. This could be a premonition of his actual demise, given that the series is just halfway done. However, this week's victim of death, whether sudden or not, is in Buntaro. Rather, it's the gardener, Edu. While Blackthorn's order to the rest of the house meant no one was permitted to touch the rotting bird, Mariko informed him later that Edu, knowing any trespass of that order, meant Death volunteered to steal it. He'd been ill recently and took the pheasant. While fully aware of the consequences, the bird meant nothing to me. Blackthorn numbly insists, "Your words gave it meaning." Mariko counters. Unbeknownst to many, however, Ujro's death also accomplishes other goals, while Blackthorn laments his alleged part in an elderly man's death. The gardener turns out to be a useful loose end on his own Yabushige, and his nephew Omi have been looking into the evidence pertaining to a surreptitious spy in Ajiro, who has been communicating with Toranaga all along. Conveniently, the letters are hidden in Ujro's house and discovered only after the man has passed away. This allows Toranaga's true spy, Yasari Takshima's character, Raji, Chi, a fisherman, and former samurai, to carry out his illegal operations. As if things couldn't possibly get any worse on Shogun. In the wake of Ujro's death and that absolute disaster of a dinner with Buntaro, you can hardly fault Blackthorn for coming to the conclusion that he wants to leave Japan permanently. It's a sentiment he doesn't hesitate to express to Toranaga when given the first opportunity for some face time with his lord. However, Toranaga, seemingly sensing the tension going on between Blackthorn and Mariko, even going as far as to reference a shadow hanging over both of them, declares that he can't be bothered with this nonsense and strides across the field to let the two of them hash it out. But a flock of suddenly dispersed birds from the tree line, more birds, signals that everyone's about to have an even bigger disaster on their hands. Do you recall the tiny earthquake Blackthorn felt not too long ago? That pales in comparison to the massive kahuna that strikes out of nowhere. Men are quickly engulfed by the earth. The ground trembles and splits, and in the midst of it all, a landslide carries Toranaga over the brink. After Blackthorn, Mariko, and Nagakado successfully extract him, the Lord is left without his swords, until Blackthorn chooses to give him the ones that Fuji gave him in the previous episode. Most of our primary protagonists appear to be in good physical condition, but Ajiro is in disarray after the earthquake. And when Blackthorn returns home in a few days, he discovers that Fuji has been hurt in the commotion. As he wordlessly surveys the destruction left in the wake of that phenomenon, he strides out to the garden and begins reassembling the rocks in their proper place, the way he once watched to Ajuru moving them around. Seems like Blackthorn won't be booking his one-way departure from Japan anytime soon. But back in Osaka, Toranaga's adversaries only appear to be multiplying, particularly after Lord Ishido discovers Jozen's skull in a box when he opens the most recent shipment he received. At about the same time, Lady Chiba, the mother of the late Tak and consort of the late Tak, travels to the city and meets with Ishio face to face late at night to express her gratitude for bringing her son back. Considering everything, it appears that the combination of these two will only be disastrous for Toranaga, particularly as Chiba appears to be acting solely to secure her son's succession as the new emperor. But what does she have up her impressive sleeves now that she's telling Ishido, in no uncertain terms, that the Council of Regents has to do what she says? We'll have to wait until next week's episode to find out exactly what Chiba's plan could entail, both for Ishido and Toranaga himself.